So I'd like to start by thanking the team that makes Tesserae possible, Neil Coffey, Chris Forstall, and Walter Shirer. Everything that I'm going to present today depends on this miraculous tool. And to take up the terms of Patrick's presentation, we're isolating here one strand of a multi-stranded system, the match of two individual lemata. So, intertextuality is what makes Latin poetry tick. It's one of the dominant modes of composition. Later poets constantly reuse and vary the words, images, figures, narratives, and themes of earlier poets. To take Lotman's statement and make it specific to the reading of Latin epic, Andrew Zissos has written words about Valerius Flaccus's Argonautica that could be applied easily to any Latin epic. Quote, dense, multi-level allusivity is a defining and constitutive feature. In contemplating virtually any passage, the reader's awareness of the reception and reworking of a wide spectrum of earlier literature is a crucial determinant of the aesthetic effect, unquote. Text reuse, talked about in many presentations today, is just something I'm going to assume that is basic knowledge for the audience, and look at how typically this has been talked about by classicists up to this point. The philological commentary, such as Zissos' exemplary commentary in the first book of the Argonautica, has been the standard means of collating and interpreting large numbers of instances of text reuse. But large here is a relative term. With Tesserae's aid, we can now collate far more quickly. My current project is a commentary on the second book of Silius Italicus' Punica, a Latin epic written at the end of the 1st century AD. Like Zissos' commentary on the Argonautica, it too is attempting to collate large numbers of instances of text reuse and question how can they be ranked in a relative fashion. So, details on how Tesserae enables the commentator to do this, I'll divide into four main headings. A basic search for shared phrases, the first of the options that the program gives you. An advanced feature still under development, a multi-text search for shared phrases, a character 3-gram feature, which will have many aspects in common with Patrick's study of alliteration, and after these microphilological inquiries, the beginning of a macrophilological inquiry, a study of comparative rates of text reuse among the different layers of the tradition. So, when choosing what kind of search to run on Tesserae, the choice of a target and source text can be determinative. In other words, you're going to get different kinds of reuse results depending if you're working within the same genre, as I am here, or within two radically different genres. At the end of the presentation, I'll talk about how different genres can represent a baseline for text reuse within the same genre. Whether you pick the line of poetry or a phrase within a particular line can be determined whether you are looking at allusion within a narrow frame or within a somewhat wider window of text where individual keywords may not be confined within the dimensions of a single line. Choosing the size of your stop list will give a commentator a different aspect of the tradition. Sometimes allusion can occur with very, very common words. So one sets the stop list too high at one's peril. Similarly, the distance between words varies whether you are comparing to poetic text or to prose text. Much more frequently, deliberate reuses of text in poetry will occur in phrases that are much closer together, whereas in a prose comparison, such words will be separated by the length of a paragraph or maybe even more. So this turned out to be the best practice for comparing one epic text to another. For other kinds of studies and other kinds of genres, different parameters work better. So this is what the first set of results for the most basic fundamental intertextual search between Silius and his revered predecessor Virgil is going to give you. It may be difficult to see, but the keywords are highlighted in red. Let me separate them out to talk about their distinctiveness. So these phrases are ones that feature distinctive language that are unlikely to occur simply through the reuse of a common vocabulary. They point rather to specific pointed reuses of Virgilian text by Silius. So it is unlikely that resounding with free-throated barking is simply going to occur, not just in terms of lexical items, but also the fact that they occur exactly in the same place in the line, with trifalci at the end of one line and personat at the beginning of the next. That, as far as we go, that's as much as the gun will smoke when looking for proof of an intertextual allusion. Others, as we'll see in a minute, are far more ambiguous and require a commentator to intervene and make a judgment call. We of course hate to do that. So this is when you get hits that are semantically meaningful. In other words, nomine plebem occurring at the end of the line in both poems is semantically meaningful. It means the crowd of people by name in both cases, but it is probably not interpretively significant. If you look up the context of both of these hits, you find that they are very different in nature. One is an etymological figure explaining the name of Valerius Publicola, the great hero of the people. The other describes the rampage of a hero through a camp while the enemy sleeps. It's not worth the ingenuity trying to link those two, especially when Tesserae will serve up an example of where the later poet does mean to attack this particular passage of Virgil. But what he's done is substitute a different lemma, substitute a different word for crowd rather than a word for the populace. How we can uncover that using Tesserae, I'll get to in just a minute. But this is simply a caveat to suggest that not everything Tesserae serves up, even if, as we can see, it scores it very high, is necessarily going to be of immediate use to the commentator. Judgment and attention to context is still an absolute requirement. Now, in terms of the history of the commentary tradition, this is the most carefully studied of intertextual relationships in Silius's poem. His relationship and reuse of Virgilian text is what every commentator begins with. So for the next commentator in line to come to something new is actually quite a challenge, but luckily one that Tesserae can add to. And here I'm looking at this collocation, fele venena and fele veneni, both words meaning poison. And what we have here is a hitherto unnoticed allusion to a famous passage of Virgil. Right at the end of the epic, the king of the gods sends a demon to destroy one of the heroes. He sends the Dira to destroy Turnus. What Silius intends to pick up from Virgil here is a different aspect of the simile that Virgil uses to describe that. Virgil compares the speed of the Dira that descends to incapacitate Turnus to the speed of the arrow shot by the Parthian bowman. What Silius wants to point to is an aspect of the simile that Virgil had not meant to highlight, the poison on the Parthian bowman's arrows. This becomes a comparison for him to the poison that his demon uses to destroy an entire population in this case. Because of the similarity in the words' meaning, they are both words for poison, and because of their different narrative emplotment, they are not part of a simile the way they are here. Commentators can easily be forgiven for having skipped over them. And indeed, it takes a different tool, a search of the Packard Humanities Latin Literature database, to recognize that this is in fact a unique collocation, only found in these two poets. So, discoveries like these show Tesserae's power as a tool to add to our data set, again with the caveat that discrimination and judgment are still required in order to determine criteria of relevance. So I began with an example of where Tesserae improves our understanding of the most carefully studied intertextual relationship, that between Silius and Virgil. One of the less well-known intertextual relationships. If Silius's epic is little known, Charippus's Johannes is even less so. It's one of those epics that will be read when Homer and Virgil are forgotten, but not before. So, in existence, even one commentary on one book of the 8-book Johannes is a welcome event in scholarship. So, scoring points and saying, we added to the commentator's set isn't quite as relevant here. However, what Tesserae does is quickly gives one a sense of Silius's place in the tradition available to Charippus. And here it's the middle hit that I want to focus attention on. The concept of soothing wild animals in speech is not new to either Latin poet. It's there before Silius. But this particular collocation of words, of calming, in this case, a lioness with speech versus calming lions with speech. Again, this is unique. only found in these two loci, clearly clear evidence that Charybdis was familiar with Silius's language. And again, the sort of thing that can only be uncovered through machine-assisted reading, not through regular human reading, which tends to focus us on particular matchups in narrative context rather than these semantic matchups. One of the typical questions for discussion in study of Silius is his relation to prose historical sources. His vast epic is often compared to the even vaster prose epic of Livy. We would like to know very much about Silius's reuse of this source. This will soon become available on Tesserae, and we will soon be able to know if there are more than a handful of meaningful instances of text reuse that Chalcanteric readers have found in both. Okay, at this point I need to issue a caveat to Tesserae's limitations, similar to the ones that we saw in Matthew's presentation regarding the semantic meaning of particular place names. Tesserae reduces every word to a lemmatic head word. So the verb mitto, meaning to send, and the form miseram can appear to overlap because miseram is an inflected form of the verb mitto as well as an adjective. The same form is ambiguously I had sent or miserable in the feminine. Here, any human reader quickly recognizes that it's the feminine form of the adjective, miserable as bute, and that the matchup here is incorrect. It's based on a confusion between two otherwise separate lemmata. So when I use Tesserae data as the basis of a larger statistical study, understand that those inaccuracies are going to be in there. My hope and prayer is that they're shared equally among all texts, and that they haven't clustered to a significant degree in one text rather than another, therefore allowing me to make broad-based generalizations. Okay. Back to the positives of Tesserae's power. So, as we saw, Tesserae searches generate large numbers of semantically meaningful instances of text reuse. Sometimes those meanings are sometimes those hits are semantically meaningful but not interpretively meaningful. Even if they are relatively rare words and occur close together, and as such are assigned a high score by the Tesserae scoring system, they still may not point to a unique and distinctive relationship between target and source. They may rather represent a distinctive phrase that has been widely disseminated. And so here a multi-text search shows you that these two lemmata occur together, not just in the target and the source text, but in a wide range of texts as well. I foreshortened this to fit on a slide. Here is the entire tradition of the phrase to hope for safety, sperare salutem. So it's not a Virgilian innovation, it's there in a prose author a generation before him. It is best known to us through the famous phrase where Aeneas urges his comrades not to hope for safety but to heroically sacrifice themselves, but then occurs in a variety of poetic genres and a variety of contexts. With the multi-text search, a commentator can quickly find out whether a phrase is distinctive or not, whether it points to a unique relationship between target and source, or, as in this case, is simply common parlance. Now, having said that, that doesn't mean that prevalence means that it should be discarded. Silius's line without doubt, picks up the Virgilian line, almost certainly picks up the line of Lucan, and 50% likely picks up the line of Ovid as well. For text not yet added to Tesserae, it probably picks up the line of Livy as well. The path from this phrase to its instantiation in the Punica is multi-stranded, not single-stranded. So the multi-text search both gives the commentator ideas of relevance and also begins to construct a miniature literary history of a particular phrase. Let me now build a little on Patrick's presentation by talking about the character diagram search. One of the options available to the Tesserae user is to search not for matched lemmata, but for matched patterns of 3 character clusters. And the results that this kind of search will pull up are a little bit different from the lemma search. They are aimed at a different goal of finding similarity of sound rather than similarity of lemma or semantic meaning. Having said that, they will catch things that the lemma search does not. So, for example, one famous line of the Aeneid has the goddess Juno instructing her pet demon Alecto, and threatening that she will move hell, she will move Acheron, in order to achieve her goals of destroying her enemies. Now, a lemma search will pick this up. It will pick up the phrase of Silius that says, by which you move Acheron, because Acheronta and Moeo are similar lemmata. And that's why I've started this to show that this is both available through trigram search and through lemma search. This second line, however, and all the other pairs on this page are not available through lemma search. Lemma search will not pick up these correspondences because Wideo is a different lemma from Moeo. And so you do not get that two-lemma match that we saw in the earlier slides. So here you need to focus instead on the repetition of sound, and from sound be led to meaningful context. So this is one more safety net under the commentator, as if lemma search fails, similarity in sound may lead you to those impressive and elusive Jungturae. Okay, having talked about various microphilological tools that allow a commentator to rapidly assemble the available data that link one text to another, let's look at place within a tradition. Here I'll digress a bit and talk about the scoring formula, the formula that the program applies in order to come out with a number for each hit. Words that are less frequent and closer together will receive a higher score. Words that are more frequent and further apart will receive a lower score. This is one vision of text reuse, one that says that a poet likes to keep familiar words close together in order to signal a connection to a prior text. For prose intertextuality, the criteria may be a bit different. Distance may be a less significant phenomenon than it is in poetry. That remains to be seen as we test the system further. But anyway, this works very well for hexameter epic, for windows of for phrases that fall within relatively narrow windows, and so it's on the basis of this that I arbitrarily decided to look at hits that scored between 8 and 10, given that the majority of interpretively significant hits that I was including in my commentary scored between 8 and 10 on Tesserae. So my collaborator, Kyle Gervais of the University of Otago, and I compared each book of Latin epic against every prior Latin epic, and also a control text, Caesar's Civil War. And we used a normalization formula that yielded the number of phrases that scored 8 to 10, given Tesserae's scoring formula, per 100 lines of source text as reused in each 100 lines of target text. What this led us to is a total rate by which we were able to compare the different Latin poets' rates of textual reuse. One hypothesis we want to test is one bandied about pretty easily in the scholarship, that the Flavian poets are mere slavish imitators of Virgil, that they have no originality. That's a statement that we no longer believe so readily these days and makes studying Flavian epic all the more fun, but it was a commonly held belief for a very long time in Latin literary studies. This begins to let us put data behind it. And yes, we find out that Silius's reuse of Virgilian phrases does indeed occur at a somewhat higher rate than other Latin poets, but not egregiously more than his nearest contemporary Statius, and not that much more than a poet who is not usually tarred with this brush, Ovid in the Metamorphoses. And it lets us see a really interesting deviation in a different poet, Lucan, one who writes on a different set of principles with a very different lexicon. And so when you break the comparison down by book, you notice, well, here is Lucan in red, at his most, quote, Virgilian, in the book when he is using Virgilian phrases at the greatest rate, he's still well below Silius Italicus, for example, or Statius' Thebaid. And that his lexicon apparently is quite different than the others, it is eschewing characteristically Virgilian vocabulary at a greater rate than his the other practitioners of the genre. When one studies book by book these various epics, as a commentator is obliged to, looking, for example, at Book 8 of the Punica, we notice a tremendous spike, which builds confidence in this method of study because any reader of the Punica recognizes as the most Virgilian book, one where Virgilian narrative, Virgilian names, Virgilian ideas are most actively in play. So one should expect this based on the a priori question, which is the most Virgilian book of the Punica. Second issue. This yellow or greenish line represents the 8-book epic of Valerius Flaccus, the Argonautica. It seems to show a steep decline in reuse of Virgil. Far steeper than the somewhat gentler decline of Statius' Thebaid here in dark blue. Sorry, that's off the Morphosis big part. Where is Statius? Here's Statius. Somewhat, this one, darker blue, is Statius' Thebaid. A somewhat gentler decline based on the trend line. My initial argument was, okay, these poets are coming into their own. They are revealing, or at least putting forward the idea of being less dependent on Virgil's lexicon as they develop their own epics. I've been changing that view as I look at examples like this, Book 8 of the Argonautica and the later books of Statius' Thebaid, because another hypothesis might be these books are less revised. In other words, books of epic that show more revision, that have had more of their creator's care, will actually be more intertextual, not less. Eschewing the words of the master isn't necessarily a dominant goal here. And books that we know are less revised, that show other markers of incompleteness, give us this, help corroborate this evidence, such as the final 2 books of Valerius Flaccus' Argonautica. Finally, what is the difference between poetry and prose? A moment ago, I talked about Lucan's Civil War poem as the least Virgilian of the set, one that deliberately eschews Virgilian vocabulary. And the numbers seem to bear that out when you look at how his epic is reused by other poets. That said, he's still a poet. And so the poets who come after him are going to reuse his lexicon, his poetic lexicon, at a far greater rate than they will use a prose lexicon. I picked Caesar's Civil War as deliberately the most simple prose available to us on in the Tesserae repository at the moment we began the study. Caesar is famous for avoiding poeticisms, avoiding high-style language in his plain and simple, just the facts narrative. So, seeing this gap between poets' reuse of even the most prosaic poet and poets' reuse of a prose author is again a confidence-building exercise, showing that this can lead the way toward understanding how reuse works in the tradition generally. Let me end with one moment of cheerleading for Tesserae by showing what can be affected by collating its data sensitively. This is just a fragment of a much larger graph constructing relationships based on text reuse between the poets, and in a future instantiation of Tesserae, we may be able to automatically generate this. Until that happy moment, working with tables that show us where the tradition is both distinctive and where it is sharing a common repository makes Tesserae an invaluable asset, not just to the commentator forced to ask microphilological questions, but to any reader of Latin literature. This should become a tool as basic to the philologist as the Packard Humanities Latin Literature Database, the Thesaurus Linguae Latinae, or the Standard Grammars. Thanks very much.